This is Beyond the Business, Weekly Digest.
Today, I will talk about the direction of the energy transition and what it means for industry, logistics, and markets. I will start with Europe, where policy is no longer just a roadmap, but an operating framework shaping how businesses function day to day. The European Green Deal, first introduced in 2019, set the long term objective of making the European Union climate neutral by 2050. What started as a strategic vision is now turning into a regulatory environment that directly affects pricing, investment decisions, and industrial competitiveness. The transition in Europe is no longer theoretical. It is being implemented through market mechanisms, regulation, and financial instruments that are already reshaping operational costs. At the center of this architecture sits the European Union emissions trading system. The principle is straightforward. A cap is placed on total emissions across covered sectors. Companies must hold allowances for every ton of carbon dioxide they emit. Those allowances can be traded, creating a market price for carbon. This system now covers power generation, heavy industry, aviation, and maritime transport. Shipping, for example, is gradually being integrated, which means carriers must now account for emissions as a direct coastline, not just a sustainability metric. For business, the implication is clear. Carbon is no longer an externality. It is priced input that affects margins and investment decisions. A major shift begins with the introduction of the second emission trading system. While the original system focused on the large emitters, the new mechanism extends carbon pricing for fuels used in buildings and road transport. In practical terms, this means the cost of carbon will increasingly be embedded in heating, mobility, and everyday energy use. The effect is structural. The transition moves from industrial balance sheets to household budgets. Energy efficiency, fuel choices, and consumption patterns become part of the economic equation for society itself. This is why the policy debate around this mechanism is not only environmental but also social. It determines how the cost of decarbonization is distributed across the economy. Another major element is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Its purpose is to ensure that imported products face a carbon cost comparable to those produced inside the Europe Union. The initial scope includes sectors such as steel, cement, aluminium, fertilizers, hydrogen, and electricity. The economic logic is straightforward. If domestic industry pays for carbon, imported goods must reflect a similar cost to prevent carbon leakage and loss of competitiveness. For global supply chains, this effectively turns carbon intensity into a trade variable. Where and how products are manufactured increasingly influences market access and not only the price. Europe is also directing significant investment toward transforming the industrial base that remains inside the region. Key initiatives include electrification of processes, large scale hydrogen pilots, and carbon capture projects aimed at sectors where emissions are harder to eliminate. Steel, chemicals, and heavy manufacturing are among the main focus areas. Some flagship projects are already underway, signaling that decarbonization is moving from strategy to physical infrastructure. The objective is not only to cut emissions but to maintain industrial capability with Europe while doing so. Revenue generated from carbon pricing mechanism does not disappear into general budgets alone. A substantial portion is challenged into dedicated funds supporting innovation, modernization of energy systems, and transition technologies. These instruments are designed to accelerate deployment and reduce the financial gap between conventional and low carbon solutions. However, the long term effectiveness of these investments will depend on how efficiently they translate into real industrial transformation rather than administrative expansion. For many companies in Europe, the transition is no longer theoretical. It is direct cost and planning factor. Some sectors openly support the direction. Companies like Siemens or Ørsted see regulatory pressure as a driver of growth because demand for electrification and renewable infrastructure keeps rising. In shipping, the tone is more cautious. Major players such as Maersk publicly support decarbonization goals, but they also stress that regulation must remain global and not regional. Their concern is simple: if costs rise faster in Europe than in other regions, trade flows and competitiveness can shift. Other shipping groups have voiced similar concerns in industry forums. The main issue is not the direction of change, but the speed and uneven global implementation. Shipping operates internationally, so regional carbon pricing creates operational complexity and cost uncertainty. Airlines express comparable views. Companies like Lufthansa support climate targets but warn that higher carbon costs directly affect pricing and margins. Heavy industry remains the most divided. Producers such as ArcelorMittal invest in low carbon production in Europe, while at the same time cautioning that high energy and carbon costs can push investment elsewhere if the gap widens. Energy companies show the opposite dynamic. Groups like Enel and Iberdrola strongly back the transition because their business models benefit from electrification and renewable expansion. Across sectors, one pattern stands out. Few large companies openly oppose that transition, but many emphasize the same issue: the balance between climate ambition and economic competitiveness. For business, that transition is not only about emissions, it is about cost visibility, global alignment, and long term predictability. Taken together, these policies show a clear pattern. The European transition is being built through regulation first, with markets adjusting around it. Carbon pricing, trade mechanisms, and target investment are turning climate policy into structural economic framework. For businesses and logistic operators, this means planning cannot rely only on technology trends. It must account for regulatory, cost redistribution, and shifting competitiveness across regions. In Europe, the transition is no longer just about reducing emissions. It is about redesigning the rules under which the economy operates. The direction of the energy transition in the United States looks very different from Europe. Where Europe builds rules first, the United States builds markets. The center of gravity here is not regulation, but capital, and the key framework shaping the current phase in the Inflation Reduction Act adopted in 2022, which unlocked roughly $369 billion in climate and clean energy incentives. This is not a theoretical policy, it is a capital deployment mechanism. Since its adoption, hundreds of new projects have been announced across battery manufacturing, hydrogen, renewables, and industrial decarbonization. States compete to attract factories. Companies compete to secure tax credits. Supply chains begin to reorganize around access to subsidies. The logic is simple. Instead of forcing transition through price signals, the United States accelerates it by lowering the cost of building new systems. A large share of the funding is directed toward manufacturing capacity. Battery plants in the Midwest, electric vehicle supply chains in the South, hydrogen hubs along the Gulf Coast, grid expansion projects across multiple states. This is not only about emissions, it is also about industrial positioning. Energy transition policy in the US is tightly connected to domestic production, jobs, and technological leadership. And that creates a very different dynamic from Europe's regulatory model. Large corporations have largely welcomed the investment driven approach. Companies like Microsoft and Amazon continue to sign long term clean energy agreements to secure power for data infrastructure. Tesla expands battery and manufacturing capacity with strong policy support. NextEra Energy and other developers scale renewable projects in response to stable tax incentives. At the same time, traditional energy companies such as ExxonMobil and Chevron support elements of the transition but focus heavily on carbon capture and infrastructure where their expertise remains relevant. Utilities often point to another challenge. The scale of electrification requires massive grid upgrades, and those upgrades will take time and capital. So while the investment environment is positive, the operational complexity remains high. Unlike Europe, where the main uncertainty is regulatory cost in the United States, the key uncertainty is political continuity. Many incentives depend on policy stability. A shift in political priorities could slow funding flows or change program design. For investors and industry, this creates a different kind of risk. Not the cost of compliance, but the durability on incentives. The investment wave is already reshaping industrial geography. Manufacturing that once moved offshore is partially returning. Ports adapt to new cargo mixes, rail and trucking networks see growing demand linked to energy infrastructure. Hydrogen and carbon capture projects create new industrial corridors, especially along the Gulf Coast. So the transition in the US is not only about energy production, it is also about rebuilding the physical backbone of the industrial economy. The US model shows a transition driven less by restrictions and more by incentives. Markets move where capital flows. This creates speeds and scale, but also dependence on policy stability and long term funding. For global companies, the implication is clear. Operating across the Atlantic now means navigating two very different transition logics. Europe shapes behavior through rules, the United States shapes behavior through investment. And together they form an energy transition landscape that is no longer uniform but structurally asymmetric. Looking at both sides of the Atlantic, the contrast is clear. Europe is building a rule driven transition. The United States is building an investment driven one. The destination is similar: lower emissions, new energy systems, and industrial transformation. But the pathways are fundamentally different. In Europe, the transition reshapes behavior through pricing, regulation, and compliance. In the United States, it reshapes behavior through capital, incentives, and market expansion. For global industry, this is no longer just a climate story. It is an operating reality. Different cost structures, different planning horizons, different risks, and increasingly different competitive advantages depending on where a company builds, produces, and moves goods. The energy transition is no longer a single global process, it is becoming a geopolitical one. And for businesses, logistic networks, and long term infrastructure decisions, understanding this divergent path is no longer optional. It is part of how the strategy is built now.